All right, so now that we've been able to split up our server into multiple files, each file with its own route, the next thing I want to take a look at is something I mentioned a little while ago. Because currently, these routes that we've created, if you remember, are sending back all of the notes whenever we make any updates to the notes database. And this is fine right now, but it's really not going to be ideal as time goes on because as users start to have more and more notes, we could very quickly run into a situation where, this puts a lot of strain on our server. So what I'm going to show you how to do is change this around so that instead of sending back all the updated notes each time we make some kind of update to the notes database, we're just going to send back whatever the update happened to be. Okay, so basically what we're going to be doing here is having our front end take over some of the logic from the back end. All right, so just going into this, our list notes route, that one's fine. We don't need to make any changes there. But in our create note route, what we're going to want to do is instead of sending back all of the updated notes, we're going to just want to send back the note that we just created. All right, and the way that we're going to have to do that here, remember that when we insert a document into MongoDB through the Mongo shell, we end up seeing something called an inserted ID. And you can't see that here in mine. Let me just insert one here. If we say db.notes.insert1, and we'll just create a note with the ID of 123, we'll have the title of this is a test, and we'll have some empty content there. If we insert that now, notice that it says acknowledge true and inserted ID. It has this big MongoDB ID. Now, we're not actually using this ID on the front end, but we will want to include that as data when we send it back because, it's just a piece of data that could potentially come in handy down the road. So the way that we get that here, we have to say const result equals await notesdb.insert1. And then if we want the newly generated ID, what we have to do is just say const mongo ID or something like that equals result.inserted ID. Okay, and that will give us the ID that was just inserted and automatically generated by MongoDB for the new note that we just inserted. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to send this back to the client with that new Mongo ID. And what that's going to look like is we're going to say response.json, and we're going to take all of the properties that we just created here. So in fact, we should probably move this out into its own variable by saying const new note equals, and then here, let me try that again. We'll say const new note equals, and then inside of here, we're going to paste those properties, and then we can say insert one new note instead. Awesome. So now that we have that, the next thing we're going to do is when we send this back to the client, we're going to use all of the data from our new note along with the new MongoDB ID. So we'll just say ID Mongo ID, and remember that this underscore ID thing is the name that MongoDB automatically gives to its ID property, internally. So essentially what's happening here is what we're sending back to the client is identical to what that data now is in our database. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to have our front end actually take this data that it just got back and modify its state so that it has this new note inside of that state. So what that's going to look like, we're going to open up our notes provider that we created. And where we create the note, what we're going to do is in the response, this is no longer the new updated notes array. This is just the note that we created. So all we need to do here is say something like const new note equals response.data. And then we want to set notes not to response.data, but to our current notes state, okay, with that new note inserted. This is sort of similar to what we were doing before we actually converted it over to make network requests, if you recall. So we're just going to say set notes to notes.concat new note. And that will take care of adding that new note to our notes list. All right, so we should be able to see if we go back here and try and create a note. Might have to refresh this here. Yep, there we go. We see this is a test note. I was a little confused about where that came from for a second. Let's try adding a new note here now. We'll say, does it work? And if we click create, we should see that that shows up immediately. Cool, so that's our create note route, and that's how we rewrite it. Basically, what we're going to do for the other routes is rewrite them in a very similar way. So I'm just going to close some of these here to reduce the clutter. The next one we're going to do is the update note route, and all we're going to want to do here is return the updated data for that note. What we're going to do is, instead of saying updated notes, blah, 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 we're going to change this now to find one and update. Okay, you may remember this function on MongoDB from a while ago. Basically what it does is it updates something and then allows us to return that document. So what that'll look like, we'll say const result equals await notesdb.find one and update. We are going to have to add another configuration setting to this, which is return document after. That makes sure it returns the updated document and not and not the document before updating, because if you look at the name of this function, it says find one and update. That makes it sound like find one and then update, which is the default behavior. So by saying return document after, that makes it so that it actually returns the document after the document has been updated. All right, so now we just have to say const updated note equals result dot value, and then we're going to return updated note to the client. All right, so now back in our notes provider here, we're going to need to change our update note function a little bit. And what we're going to have to do is, instead of setting our notes to the response.data, which is what we were doing in create note beforehand as well, we're going to say const updated note equals response.data. And then inside set notes, we're going to say set notes to, and we're going to have to do that crazy map thing that we did before. Basically, we're just going to say notes.map. And for each note, we're going to check to see if that's the note that we wanted to update. So if note ID is equal to ID, then return updated note. Otherwise, return the note itself. Okay, so that's just how we do that. We're just updating this individual note that we wanted to update with that ID, and that should work as well. Let's give this a try. We're going to open up one of these new notes here. We'll say edit, and we'll just type some stuff in here. And if we click Save Changes, we should see that that updates just like we want it to. Now, one thing I just noticed here is it does flash briefly for a second before the value actually updates. And the way that we can fix that is inside our note detail page. We just need to make sure we wait for the update note function to happen by saying await. We're going to have to convert this to an async function. And that should make sure that it doesn't actually set isEditing to false until the update note function has completed. So just to show you what this looks like, it's going to be a very subtle change. So let's just make a little change here. Click Save Changes. And sure enough, we won't see the old values flash as we did before. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do here is update our delete note route. So let's open that up here. We're going to say delete note route. And again, instead of returning the updated notes, well, for this one, what we can actually do is just return a status code, right? Our client side doesn't really need to know anything about what just happened besides that it was successful. So to do that, we can just say response.send status and send a 200 status code signifying that everything was okay. All right, and that's pretty much all we need to do. So let's go back now to our notes provider and modify our delete note function here so that instead of getting the response data, we're just going to say set notes to. In fact, we don't even need the response really, since if it's not a 200 status code, it will throw an error and get to here. We're just going to say set notes to notes.filter note ID is not equal to ID. Okay, and that will delete that note from our state variable in our notes provider. So let's give that a try now. We're going to go back here. We're going to try deleting a note. And if we say yes, that should work out perfectly. Cool, so we've rewritten our backend in a way that will reduce strain on it. One other thing that I wanted to point out that I don't think I pointed out beforehand, and that benefit is that writing our routes in this way helps to decouple our application logic from the specific Express package that we're using, right? Express is a very useful and also very popular package to write servers with, but there are other options as well. And if you ever wanted to change from Express to another one of those packages, like Happy, for example, that would be very difficult if you wrote all of your routes by saying app.get, app.post, app.blah, blah, blah. But what doing this allows us to do is, we could change all of the code in our server.js file, right? By saying server.js, we could replace Express with some other framework completely, and we could potentially not have to change these routes at all, because all it contains here, well, the only Express-specific thing that it contains right now is just the basic data structure on the request and response objects, right? How those work. If we wanted to, we could actually reduce that dependency even more by getting rid of the request and response here and having our server pass in that data automatically. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that right now. That's more of an architectural level decision, but I just wanted to point out that expressing your routes in a more declarative fashion like we're doing here, declarative meaning we're just specifying different configurations, so to speak, about the route, instead of actually saying app.get, app.post, that makes our application potentially much more flexible in the future. All right, so I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.